The screen lit up, a video call from my son's house. I smiled, thinking they finally remembered me on Christmas Eve. But the moment I answered, my daughter-in-law, Maddie, dressed in bright red, standing in the middle of a crowded Christmas party, threw her head back and shouted, "Oh, Catherine, we totally forgot about you." The whole room roared with laughter. Behind her, glasses clinked, lights flashed, and my son Ethan stood frozen, unable to defend me. Everyone was invited, everyone except me. I ended the call, picked up my silver JM the Calm box, and whispered, "Then I'll host my own Christmas." By morning, I was standing beside my new 10mm villa, and the photo I posted sent them all into panic. Far, far too late. To understand why I left, you have to understand the silence that started it all, 24 hours before the photo. The navy scarf lay folded on the chair beside me, its soft wool catching a thread of winter light that slipped through the kitchen window. Bainbridge Island was quiet in the way only a cold December evening could be. Water tapping against the shore, wind humming under the eaves, and the faint smell of cedar wood drifting from the candle I had lit out of habit rather than celebration. I stirred the turkey stuffing slowly, letting the warmth rise into my hands. It was the same recipe Jonathan and I used every Christmas, and for a moment the rhythm of it steadied my breath. Then my phone vibrated on the counter. A single message lit the screen. Not a call. Not yet. Just a cold, sharp text in the dim kitchen. "Catherine, since Christmas dinner is small this year, we thought it'd be best if you rest at home." I didn't move at first. My fingers hovered above the bowl, the spoon sinking slowly into the mixture, as if the weight of that sentence pulled everything downward. The wind pressed against the window pane, a low, hollow sound. I picked up the phone, and my hand trembled just enough for me to notice. Small dinner. Rest at home. My heart tightened as I read it again. Maddie always chose her words carefully, polite enough to be excused, distant enough to leave a mark. I felt the cold draft slip under the door, brushing my ankles like a reminder of how empty the house truly was. Another notification appeared. "Ethan, we'll drop by tomorrow." No explanation, no reassurance, not even a question asking how I felt. Just a thin, brittle promise floating between us. I set the phone down, letting it rest against the wooden counter. The silence in the kitchen deepened. My body reacted before my mind did. I drew a slow breath, stepped back from the stove, and steadied myself with one hand on the edge of the sink. Something inside me folded quietly, like a page turned without sound. A knock broke the stillness. I opened the door to find Elaine standing there with a coil of string lights around her arm. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her breath floating in small clouds. "You okay, dear?" she asked softly. I managed a smile. "I'm fine." But my eyes slipped past her shoulder, back toward the small wooden comb on the table, the one Jonathan carved years ago, still warm in memory if not in touch. Elaine followed my gaze, her expression tightening as if she understood more than I'd said. She squeezed my arm gently before stepping back. "If you need anything, I'm right next door." When the door closed, the house seemed even quieter than before. The navy scarf sat untouched, the candle flickered. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the sea into the room, cold and unmistakably lonely. I picked up the phone again, scrolling through the family group chat I rarely opened. A stream of photos appeared. Relatives laughing, arranging place settings, clinking glasses beside the tall Christmas tree Maddie adored. Every single person invited. Even cousins I hadn't seen in 7 years. The stuffing on the stove began to cool. My shoulders sank as the truth settled into place, not sharp but heavy, like snow collecting on a roof. Christmas is supposed to be warm. Why does mine feel like a closed door? I turned away from the counter, needing air. When I reached for my coat, another notification slid across my screen, this time an email. Subject, Silvercrest Villa. Title transfer. Ready for review. 48 hours. For a moment, I just stared at it, the glow of the screen reflecting in the kitchen window. A door had closed. But something else, somewhere, had quietly opened. Sleep never came. The clock on the microwave read 2:14 a.m., its green light the only warmth in the cold, dark kitchen. I wrapped my navy scarf tighter around my shoulders, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. I couldn't stay here. Not after that message. Not in a house that suddenly felt like a waiting room for a life I was no longer invited to. I stood in front of the small cabinet where Jonathan kept the things he considered too meaningful to toss but too heavy to display. My fingers hesitated on the drawer pull in the dark before I finally clicked on a small lamp. The shadows retreated just enough. The silver box lay inside. The initials JM were engraved in the corner, catching the dim light. I carried it to the kitchen table. When I lifted the lid, the faint scent of cedarwood rose, a ghost of him in the empty room. Inside, Jonathan's handwriting appeared on folded papers. I unfolded the first page, my hands trembling slightly in the quiet night. If she's ever pushed out, give her a way back to herself. The sentence was written in his careful script. My throat tightened. Even from the past, he was awake with me. Beneath the note was a sketch of a long Christmas table, walnut wood, curved edges, the family he believed would always stay close. I pressed the corner of the sketch flat, forcing myself to breathe. More papers waited beneath. A sealed letter, the Marshall Heritage Fund, $3.1 million, frozen until activation by Catherine Marshall only. I stared at the words. Jonathan had hidden this not out of secrecy, but protection. He always planned 5 steps ahead. My phone lay on the table. It was nearly 2:30 a.m. A rational person would wait until morning, but the instructions in the box were specific. Call the private line, anytime, day or night. It's handled. I dialed the number. I expected a voicemail. Instead, a voice answered on the first ring, alert, calm, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment for years. Identity verified, the attorney's voice said gently. Hello, Catherine. I've been expecting this call. There was no question about the hour, no surprise, just the sound of a plan clicking into motion. When the document portal on my screen refreshed, a new notification appeared, glowing bright in the dark room. Silvercrest Villa. Title transfer. Ready for signing. Silvercrest. I remembered Jonathan whispering about it once. Too beautiful to lose to the wrong hands. I leaned back in my chair, the shadows of the kitchen stretching long across the floor. My gaze drifted to the walnut comb resting on the counter. Jonathan carved it during our second winter together. I picked it up, slipping it into my pocket. If they can forget me this easily, maybe I should start remembering myself right now, before the sun even rises. I tapped the screen. Signed. The seller listed on the transfer form was Harlan Pierce, Jonathan's closest friend, the man who kept promises even in the dead of night. I stood up. The clock now read 2:48 a.m. The silence in the house no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like a departure. I grabbed my keys. I left a note on Elaine's porch before the sun rose, the paper weighed down by a small pine cone so the wind wouldn't carry it away. I kept the message simple. I'll be gone for a few days. Don't worry about me. The quiet street was still asleep, the houses trimmed with faint Christmas lights, their colors muted by the early morning fog. My breath lingered in the cold air as I stepped toward my old Subaru, the navy scarf wrapped firmly around my neck. When I started the engine, the dashboard lights flickered softly, and the radio came alive with one of Jonathan's favorite songs, a gentle guitar line he used to hum while cooking Sunday breakfast. The sound hit me in a tender spot, both painful and comforting, as if he had slipped into the passenger seat to guide me forward. If you ever feel like you can't breathe, he once told me, find a place wide enough to let your heart stretch again. I held on to that memory as I backed out of the driveway. The cedarwood candle I'd forgotten in the cup holder released a faint, warm scent when the heater blew across it, filling the car with a whisper of home. The road ahead was dark, but open, a long ribbon leading toward the Cascades. As I drove through the outskirts of town, the scenery shifted, streetlights giving way to towering evergreens, their branches heavy with fresh snow. The tires hummed steadily beneath me, and each mile carried a layer of weight off my chest. The deeper I went into the mountains, the more the world seemed to widen. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield, catching the headlights like sparks. The road curved gently upward, and the forest opened in places, revealing glimpses of pale sky. For the first time in a long while, I felt something like breath returning to my body. A soft buzz sounded from my phone in the console. When I stopped at a scenic shoulder to stretch, I checked the screen. A message from Elaine. "We asked about you. No one knew where you were. At the dinner table, they said, 'We forgot her.' It wasn't right." I stared at the words, the cold sinking gently into my gloves. They forgot her. Not Catherine. Her. It was strange how a single shift in wording could change the shape of pain. Suddenly, I wasn't just someone they pushed aside. I was someone others noticed missing, someone worth asking about. The ache in my chest loosened another fraction, and I let the mountain air fill the space it left behind. When I stepped back into the car, the sky had lightened to a soft gray, and the road ahead glowed faintly under the snow. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, feeling the warmth of the scarf against my neck, and pulled onto the highway again. I thought I was driving away from them, but maybe, just maybe, I was driving back to myself. The road narrowed as I approached the edge of Leavenworth, the trees parting just enough to reveal a rise in the landscape. At the top stood Silvercrest Villa, its cedarwood exterior glowing softly against the snow. Warm light spilled from the tall windows, casting long golden shapes onto the driveway. I parked at the foot of the steps and sat for a moment, letting the sight settle into me. It felt unreal, like stepping into a place Jonathan had described in dreams, not documents. When I finally stepped out, the cold bit at my cheeks, but the air carried a sweetness from the surrounding pines. I walked up the steps with measured breaths, the navy scarf tucked close to my chin. Before I reached the door, it opened. "Catherine Marshall?" a man asked, his voice deep with familiarity. "I've been waiting for you." Harlan Pierce stood framed in the doorway, taller than I remembered, and with a gentleness in his eyes that eased the tension in my chest. Snowflakes clung to his coat, melting slowly in the warmth behind him. "I didn't expect—" He shook his head softly. "Jonathan told me this day would come. Keep the place for her," he said. "She'll arrive when she's ready." The words caught me off guard, so simple yet spoken with such certainty. Harlan stepped aside, gesturing me in. I crossed the threshold, and the warmth enveloped me instantly. The villa smelled of cedar and orange peel, like comfort carved into the walls. The living room stretched out before me, lined with tall windows overlooking a forest blanketed in snow. A stone fireplace glowed with steady embers, throwing sparks of gold across the room. The floors were polished cedarwood, rich and warm to the touch. I walked slowly, absorbing every detail. It was beautiful without being grand, intimate without feeling small. Jonathan would have loved it. "Your husband designed part of this place," Harlan said from behind me. "He wanted you to have a retreat, somewhere the world couldn't chip away at you." My breath caught. "He never told me. He didn't want to burden you with plans he wasn't sure he could finish," Harlan replied. "But he trusted you'd find your way here when you needed space to heal." He handed me a folder, thick with documents. I opened it carefully. Page after page bore Jonathan's signature. Design notes, property deeds, maintenance agreements. His handwriting appeared in the margins, small reminders to himself. "Cat likes natural light. Add cedar finish. Warm. Leave room for her books." Each line pulled at something deep and tender inside me. "Jonathan said this would be where you begin again," Harlan said quietly. The key line settled into me like a soft weight. Begin again. It felt unfamiliar and strangely possible. As I moved deeper into the villa, my fingers brushed along the wooden trim, worn smooth as if Jonathan had passed his own hands there countless times. Harlan reached into his coat and drew out a small brass key engraved with 2 letters, SC. "Jonathan wanted you to have this when you arrived," he said. "It opens the studio he built at the back of the house." I turned the key over in my palm. It was heavier than I expected, warm from his hand. "A studio?" "He planned a Christmas gathering here," Harlan explained. "A real one, with a long table, music, family, the kind he hoped you'd share. He finished most of it, but time ran ahead of him." My throat tightened. The idea of Jonathan preparing a future he never got to live felt like both a gift and a wound. I looked toward the hallway leading to the back of the villa, the brass key resting in my hand. Healing hadn't begun the moment I walked through the door. It began now, with something Jonathan left waiting for me. I was miles away in the mountains when the storm began in Seattle. I didn't feel the wind change or see the tension snap, but later, piece by painful piece, I learned exactly how the night unraveled. The truth traveled back to me in fragments, saved messages, shaken voices, and the kind of confessions people only make when they realize silence has consequences. As I walked through the warm, quiet halls of Silvercrest, a very different kind of cold was settling over the home I had just left behind. It started, I was told, when the dinner had barely begun. Cousin Marla, who never could abide an empty chair, apparently raised her glass and called out across the room, "Ethan, where's your mom? Christmas feels strange without Catherine." Her voice carried over the chatter, light at first, unaware of the fault line it had struck. Ethan later told me that Maddie smiled too quickly. It was, he admitted, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a shield used to deflect inquiry. "Oh, she doesn't like big gatherings," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It overwhelms her." A small lie. Just one sentence. But I can imagine the way it must have hung in the air. Sometimes a single untruth can tilt the whole room. I wasn't there to see the relatives trading glances or lowering their wine glasses, but I know my family. I know the way the temperature of a conversation shifts, subtle but sharp, like a draft slipping through a cracked window. I wasn't there to feel it, but looking back, I can almost feel the sting of it on my own skin. Not long after that, the inevitable happened. Someone at the party, no one wanted to admit who, recorded a video of Maddie talking with Veronica near the kitchen doorway. They hadn't meant to catch them. They were likely trying to record their kids by the tree. But the microphone picked up everything. "Catherine always makes everything so heavy," Maddie's voice said on the playback I eventually saw. It was tight, defensive. And then Veronica, leaning closer, "She's too sensitive. It's embarrassing." Within minutes, that short clip jumped from one phone to another, little bursts of light traveling around the table, like sparks from a fire. And sparks always land somewhere. By the time it reached the family group chat, the mood in the room had changed entirely. I can picture the notifications lighting up the screens I wasn't watching. Did she really say that? What's going on with Maddie? Why talk about Catherine that way? Ethan told me he opened the video during dinner. One second he was holding a fork. The next he said it clattered onto the plate, his hand suddenly unable to hold the weight of anything. He watched the clip twice, then a third time, as if repetition could somehow make it untrue. But words don't soften just because we wish they would. He stepped out onto the porch, phone pressed to his ear. He called me once, then again, and again. "Mom, please pick up, please." I didn't hear his voice that night. My phone was buried deep in my coat pocket while I tried to understand the strange comfort of Jonathan's villa. But later, when he replayed the moment for me, describing the panic rising in his throat, his voice cracked the same way frozen branches do when the wind forces them to bend. Still, I didn't answer. I had no idea what kind of panic was unfolding on the other side of the Cascades. Then came the message that shifted everything. Elaine, my faithful neighbor back on the island, texted Ethan. She didn't know the chaos of the party. She only knew the emptiness of my driveway. Your mom's car is gone. It's been gone since about 3 a.m. I think she left on her own. When Ethan told me about reading that text, he said his heart dropped in a way he had never felt before. It wasn't just the cold guilt of being caught or the shame of public embarrassment. It was something deeper, something raw. He told me that in that moment, staring at the screen, he finally understood the difference between losing face and losing someone who loved him without conditions. Inside the crowded dining room, people kept eating and laughing. But for him, the warmth had drained from the air. Witnesses said he returned to the table pale and unfocused. A cousin asked if he was all right, but he couldn't answer. He just kept staring at his phone, at the list of missed calls stacking up without a single reply. 20 minutes later, another relative messaged the family chat, the question echoing louder than the music playing in the background. "Where is Catherine? No one seems to know." Back at Silvercrest, I paused in the hallway, completely unaware of the storm white-knuckling its way through my family. I wasn't thinking about their worry. I wasn't thinking about the noise building like a wave. I was simply breathing in the scent of cedarwood and letting the quiet of the mountains settle into my bones. But in Seattle, Ethan's chest tightened. He told me he stepped outside again, into the snow that was beginning to fall in soft, relentless sheets. He tried calling me once more, ring after ring, swallowed by the cold. "Where are you, Mom?" he whispered to the voicemail I wouldn't check for hours. "I should have protected you. I'm so sorry." I didn't hear those words then, but something inside me that night felt oddly steadier than usual, as if silence, my silence, was the only boundary I still had control over. Silence is sometimes the last line between you and the people who assume your love is endless. More snow began to drift through the city, dusting the neighborhood roofs, coating the streets that led from my empty driveway. Ethan stared down at his phone, realizing the screen now showed 18 missed calls, all unanswered. Somewhere between worry and fear, he finally stood up from the porch and grabbed his keys. He realized then that he couldn't wait for an answer that wasn't coming. While he prepared to chase a truth he had ignored for too long, I walked deeper into the villa, unaware of the path that had just opened for both of us. The brass key felt heavier than it looked as I walked down the quiet hallway toward the back of the villa. The air grew warmer the closer I came to the door, as if the room behind it held a pulse of its own. My hand paused on the handle for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle inside me. Then I turned the key. The door opened with a soft click. Light from the tall window spilled across the floor, catching on tiny motes of dust that shimmered like slow-falling snow. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood, the same scent Jonathan loved. For a moment I stood still, letting the warmth of the late morning sun wrap itself around my shoulders. I stepped inside. The studio looked frozen in time. A large drafting table stood near the center, its surface covered with unfinished sketches, mechanical pencils, rulers, and notes written in Jonathan's familiar, sharp handwriting. The edges of the table were worn smooth from years of use, as though his hands were still resting there. A small stool remained pulled slightly back, as if he had just stood up and intended to return. On the far wall hung a bulletin board filled with pinned fabric samples, color swatches, and architectural renderings. Some were marked with tiny arrows, others labeled in shorthand only he would understand. But one sketch drew my eye immediately. A long walnut table with rounded edges and candle holders built into its frame. It was a table meant for a gathering, warm and generous, meant to seat more people than we ever had in our home. A sudden ache rose in my chest. I moved slowly around the table, fingertips hovering above the paper edges, careful not to disturb them. Then something on the corner of the table caught the light, a framed photo. I lifted it gently. It was the two of us standing on the rocky shore of Whidbey Island, wind pushing at our jackets as we laughed into the sun. His arm was around my shoulder, mine curled naturally around his waist. I remembered the moment clearly. He had insisted on setting up the camera timer even though I told him the wind would knock it over, but it didn't. He always did know how to steady things. My throat tightened as I set the frame back down. On the shelf beside the drafting table rested a worn leather notebook, Jonathan's notebook. I hesitated only a second before picking it up. The leather was soft and warm from the sunlight, and when I opened it, a faint scent of cedar rose into the air, as if he had tucked the room's essence into the pages. The first thing I saw was the walnut comb, pressed into the first page, its teeth perfectly aligned, the polished surface glowing softly against the paper. My breath caught. My fingers brushed its edge, and for a moment I felt the warmth of memory more than the chill inside my chest. Below it, in Jonathan's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "If one day they forget your worth, let this place remind you." I closed my eyes, my hand resting on the page, letting the meaning sink in slowly. He had seen something I refused to imagine, that someday the family we built might forget the tenderness that once held us together. I turned the page. Sketches filled the next several sheets, layouts for the villa, diagrams of a long dining hall, notes on lighting placement to make the space feel soft and inviting. And on the bottom of one page, written almost like an afterthought, "Christmas warmth always belonged to you, Kat. I only borrowed it." My breath broke silently. The words felt like they reached backward through time, touching every Christmas we had ever shared, every quiet morning, every small kindness he had left behind. As I kept turning the pages, I found another line, smaller but clearer than any other. "If they fail to make space for you, build a new table." My hand stopped there. The truth settled into me like a stone sinking through water. Slow, heavy, inevitable. Jonathan hadn't just dreamed of building a home for us. He had anticipated the loneliness I refused to name, and he had carved out a place where I wouldn't need anyone's permission to belong. The room blurred slightly. I sank into his chair, the wood warm beneath me. The weight of the notebook, the sketches, the comb, all of it rested in my lap. And for the first time in years, long before the exclusion, long before the silence, I let myself cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't bitter. It was the quiet release of someone who had held too much for too long. Through the window, I saw movement, the faint outline of Harlan's car pulling away down the driveway. A flicker of instinct told me he hadn't told me everything yet. Something still waited between his promises and Jonathan's plans. But for now, I stayed in the warmth of the studio, letting the truth find its place inside me. I found Harlan on the back porch later that afternoon, sitting on a wooden bench that overlooked the snow-covered pines. The air was crisp, the kind that turned every breath into a small cloud. He held 2 steaming cups in his hands, and when he saw me, he nodded toward the empty seat beside him. "I made chamomile mint," he said. "Jonathan always said it helped clear the mind." I sat, grateful for the warmth that radiated from the cup he handed me. The steam curled up into the cold air, carrying a soft, calming scent. For a moment, we both watched the snow drift lazily between the trees, settling in thick white layers that muffled even the wind. "Harlan," I said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything, all of it. No more half-truths." His breath left him in a slow exhale, and he placed his cup on the railing. "I figured you'd ask." He took his time gathering the words, the snow reflecting in his eyes. "Jonathan and I weren't just friends, Catherine. We were partners. We co-founded the Cascadia Haven Project almost 20 years ago, a retirement community designed to give people dignity without losing the warmth of family." I turned slightly toward him. "He never told me you worked together on that." "He didn't want you worrying about the logistics," Harlan replied with a tired smile. "He liked keeping burdens to himself." He continued, his voice softer now. "When he got sick, he made decisions quickly. He moved all his shares, every bit of his profit, every future dividend, into the Marshall Heritage Fund. For you. Only you. A breeze swept across the porch, rattling the pine branches. I held my cup closer, letting the heat seep through my gloves. The weight of Jonathan's choices pressed warm and heavy against my heart. "Why hide it?" I asked. "Why keep all of this secret?" Harlan looked at me then, really looked, as though searching for a way to soften the truth. He worried about Ethan, worried he was too easily influenced by certain people around him. I didn't need him to say their names. Maddie, Veronica. Their voices echoed from the memory of countless strained dinners and forced smiles. Harlan's tone deepened. Jonathan didn't want his life's work ending up in the hands of people who might treat it like an asset instead of a legacy. Silence settled between us, heavier than the snow. "So, he planned it all," I murmured. "Every piece." "He did," Harlan said, "and he left instructions for me too. He said, 'Give Silvercrest to Kat only when she truly needs it, when she can no longer find her place in the life she built.'" The words hit me with unexpected force. Every moment of exclusion, every dismissal, every quiet wound, they all aligned now in a way that felt painfully intentional, as if Jonathan had seen the fracture before I ever admitted it existed. I swallowed hard. "He thought this would happen." "He hoped it wouldn't," Harlan corrected gently, "but he wanted you protected just in case." I looked down at the untouched rim of my cup, the rising steam blurring the edge of my vision. He loved me more deeply than I understood. "Yes," Harlan said simply, "he did." The porch fell quiet save for the faint music drifting from the living room, a soft instrumental piece that made the villa feel even warmer against the winter air. The snow continued to fall, steady and endless, like time itself slowing for us to breathe. Then my phone buzzed sharply in my coat pocket. I reached for it, expecting an email or a notice from the attorney. Instead, I saw a stack of missed calls, 27, all from Ethan, and a string of new messages. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping snow across the railings. Seattle was being hit harder than expected. A storm was building, and my son was calling for me. I hadn't planned to post anything. I had barely unpacked, barely understood what Silvercrest meant for me, barely taken my first full breath without feeling the weight of someone else's expectations pressing against my chest. But that afternoon, as snow drifted softly across the villa's front steps and the warm light from inside spilled onto the porch, something in me shifted. I stepped outside with my phone, wrapped my navy scarf tighter around my neck, and lifted the camera. The shutter clicked once. Just one simple image. Me standing in front of the villa, snow falling in slow circles around me, the golden glow from the windows haloing the scene. I typed a single line. Grateful for new beginnings. No anger, no accusation, no hidden message. Just truth. I set the phone down afterward, thinking little of it. The quiet of Leavenworth wrapped itself around the villa like a blanket, and inside, the scent of cedarwood warmed the air. I made tea, opened some of Jonathan's notes, and let myself feel a small, steady rise of peace. I assumed the world back home was continuing as it always did, busy, loud, and indifferent to my absence. I was wrong. Peace was the one thing no one in Seattle found that night. I didn't see the notifications lighting up screens across the city, but I learned later how fast the image traveled. Elaine was the first to share the post, her caption simple and proud. Catherine's new home. Stunning. Then cousin Marla shared it too. Within half an hour, I was told the photo threaded its way across the entire Marshall family circle, jumping from phone to phone like a spark landing in dry grass. Maddie, apparently, was the first to break. According to those who were near the hallway, she'd just stepped out to refill her glass when she saw the post. Cousin Marla told me later that the color drained from Maddie's face so fast she thought she might faint. "She bought this?" Maddie reportedly cried out, her voice cracking in disbelief. "When? How?" I wasn't there to see it, but I can imagine the scene. Veronica leaning over her shoulder, adjusting her glasses with a frown, her own insecurity masquerading as judgment. "This is humiliating," Veronica hissed, loud enough for guests to hear. "People will think we mistreated her." It is strange how the guilty always assume every action is an accusation against them. Someone at the dinner table, I never asked who, though I suspect it was Roy, replied quietly, "Didn't you?" That was the moment, I heard, that the room began to fracture. The lies they used to justify excluding me suddenly felt too thin to hide behind. Witnesses said Maddie paced the hallway, her heels clicking like sharp punctuation marks against the hardwood floor. Their voices escalated, first frustration, then blame. "This is your fault," Maddie reportedly accused her mother. "You told me she wouldn't leave the island." "And you told me Ethan kept her happy," Veronica snapped back. But while they were arguing over a photograph, a real storm was arriving. A co-worker of Maddie's, someone she didn't realize was at the same holiday party, sent a message directly to Ethan. Attached was the video, not my photo, not my doing. The video, the one where Maddie and Veronica dismissed me with careless cruelty. The one that had rippled across the family chat earlier that evening, but hadn't yet reached Ethan's eyes. But now it had. Ethan told me later that the notification lit up his phone while he was sitting beside the Christmas tree, staring absent-mindedly at the lights. He tapped it open, expecting a work greeting or a holiday meme. He didn't get that. He sat there, amidst the noise of the party, and watched his wife's face on the small screen. He listened to her disdain. He heard the tone I had lived with for years but never named. He listened to Veronica echo it, the two of them casually dismantling the woman who raised him. He told me that in that moment he felt hollowed out. It wasn't just shock. It was the cold wash of clarity. I was told he stood abruptly, knocking his chair against the table. The sound startled everyone, but Ethan didn't apologize. He barely even noticed the room around him. His hands shook as he checked his phone again, calling me. 1 call, 2, 3. I didn't hear any of them. My phone was still on the kitchen counter at Silvercrest, set to silent, wrapped in the quiet I had forgotten how to allow myself. Back in Seattle, Veronica reportedly leaned toward Maddie, whispering urgently, "If Ethan sees that video, we are done." But she was too late. He had already seen everything. Ethan described it to me later, how he looked at the list of missed calls on his screen. 48 attempts, 48 rings into silence. By the time Maddie reached him, grabbing his arm to ask what was wrong, Ethan stepped back. He said he looked at her and saw a stranger. "I need to find her," he said. His voice wasn't pleading anymore. It was certain. He grabbed his coat, his keys, his phone, and without another word to the guests, without a glance at the dinner that was supposed to be perfect, he rushed out into the night, into the wind, into the snow that had begun to fall harder across Seattle's streets. Back at Silvercrest, I lifted my teacup, completely unaware of the storm crashing through my family, unaware of the man driving into the darkness, trying to undo years of silence. Sometimes a single photo doesn't expose a truth. It simply reveals who was already watching. And that night, my son finally opened his eyes. Ethan told me later that he sped onto the highway with a force that startled even him, the wheels of his car slicing through the first heavy wave of snowfall. He said the lights of Seattle vanished in his rearview mirror almost instantly, as if the storm had swallowed the city behind him. Each mile pushed him deeper into the Cascades, deeper into a night he admitted he wasn't sure he deserved to overcome. He described the drive to me as a tunnel of chaos. The wipers struggled against the thickening sheets of snow, smearing white across the windshield faster than they could clear it. He said the snow slammed against the glass with a constant hiss, like sandpaper, and his headlights carved only a narrow, trembling path through the swirling white. I gripped the wheel until my hands went numb, he told me later, his voice quiet with the memory of it. I was terrified that if I let go, even for a second, I'd lose the only path back to you. He told me the car jolted violently when the tires slid on a patch of black ice. He gasped, steadying the vehicle with a desperate twist, his heart hammering against his ribs. The heater hummed weakly, but he said it did nothing to warm the cold storm raging inside him. The silence in the car, he confessed, was louder than the wind. It was filled with memories he couldn't outrun, memories that hit him in sharp, merciless flashes. He told me he saw me standing alone at the end of the Christmas table last year, my hands folded neatly in my lap while everyone else talked over me. He saw himself looking away. He heard Maddie's voice echoing in his mind, not from the video this time, but from a memory he had suppressed. Catherine gets overwhelmed easily. The sentence had been small then, tossed out lightly, but that night on the highway, he said it landed with the weight of a falling beam. And then, the memory that hurt him the most, his own inaction. The way he had let their world shrink around me without lifting a finger. "I let you shrink, Mom," he whispered to me later, tears in his eyes. "I pretended not to see it because it was easier than fighting for you." The highway curved sharply, and he told me panic surged through him, hot and dizzy, when the car skidded again. But he didn't stop. He kept his jaw locked, driving through the snow, spiraling in wild, nightmarish patterns under the high beams. His phone buzzed on the console. Another message from Maddie. He told me he ignored it, focusing on the slippery blacktop stretching ahead. But when he finally reached a red light at a desolate intersection, he grabbed the phone with trembling fingers. He forced himself to open the video again. This time, he watched it without flinching. He listened to Maddie's voice. "Catherine is just too much sometimes. Sensitive. It drags everyone down." He heard Veronica's reply. "Honestly, she embarrasses herself, and Ethan can't see it." He told me that what pierced him deepest wasn't the insult itself. It was the realization of how long he had allowed Maddie's insecurity to define the way he saw his own mother. He had let them shape me into a problem rather than a person. "I sat in that car," he said, "and I realized I had been blind for 20 years. A tear slid down his cheek before he could stop it. Then another. Soon the road in front of him blurred, not just from the snow, but from the grief finally breaking through. He told me he pulled the car back into motion with a choked breath. He promised himself then and there, not this time, not again. The wind roared against the car. The snow thickened. The storm grew violent, but he didn't slow down. He drove harder. For the first time since his father's funeral, Ethan allowed himself to cry. Raw, urgent, gulping breaths that fogged the windshield. Somewhere inside that pain, the boy he once was, the son who adored me, was clawing his way back to the surface. Then, a green road sign emerged from the snow-heavy darkness. Leavenworth. 14 miles. He pressed the accelerator. He told me the storm didn't matter anymore. The danger didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was reaching me before the silence became permanent. Dawn had just begun to pull a pale ribbon of light across the mountains when Ethan reached the top of the hill. The tires crunched through a thick layer of untouched snow as he turned into the driveway of Silver Crest Villa. The storm had eased, but the cold was sharper now, cutting straight through the layers of his jacket. Steam rose from the hood of his car, mingling with his own breath as he stepped out and stared at the villa, its windows glowing softly, its cedar frame catching the first warmth of morning. He swallowed hard, chest tightening. Every mile he had driven crashed back into him at once. He climbed the steps with trembling hands and knocked, not timidly, not aggressively, just honestly. The knock of someone who had finally run out of excuses. The air bit at his skin while he waited. His breath came in short bursts, clouds rising quickly and dissolving in the cold. He lifted his hand to knock again, but the door opened before he could. I stood there, framed by golden light leaking from the hall behind me. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I opened the door at the pace my heart allowed, slow enough to honor the hurt, steady enough to hold on to whatever strength I'd found in the mountains. Ethan looked at me with eyes that were already breaking. "Mom," his voice caught. then collapsed. "Mom, I was wrong. I was blind. I'm so sorry." And just like that, the son I used to know surfaced. The boy who used to run to me when storms frightened him. The boy who used to hold my hand at the Christmas markets. Now a grown man undone by his own silence. He fell to his knees on the cold wooden step, arms wrapping around my waist as if anchoring himself. His body shook from more than the cold. I felt years of unsaid apologies pouring out of him, warm and desperate. I stood still for several breaths. Not out of cruelty, but because forgiveness isn't something you rush. It's something you step toward carefully, like thin ice. Only after his sobs quieted did I rest my hand gently on his back. And slowly, I bent and wrapped my arms around him. When he lifted his face, eyes red and wet, I met his gaze fully. "What brought you all this way?" I asked softly. "Love, or the fear of losing your mother?" He swallowed hard, voice cracking. "Both, but mostly regret." Behind him, dawn brightened, casting a warm line of sunlight across the snow. It hit my shoulder, then spilled across his, binding us in the quiet truth of the moment. His breath still rose in trembling clouds, the cold turning every exhale into something visible, fragile, human. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, from the edge of the driveway, I felt, rather than heard, a presence. I looked up. Harlan stood near the tree line, hands in his coat pockets, watching without intruding. He gave a small nod, one of understanding, not ownership, before turning away. He wasn't there to replace Ethan. He never had been. He was just the keeper of Jonathan's promises, witness to a chapter finally turning. Ethan leaned forward again, collapsing into my arms with a rawness he hadn't shown since the day we buried his father. He cried openly, not caring who saw, not caring about the snow soaking into his jeans or the cold burning his hands. I rested my palm on the crown of his head, a simple gesture, one I hadn't been able to give him since the day he chose someone else's comfort over my presence. Just then, the rumble of an engine echoed faintly from the road. Gravel shifted under tires. Ethan stiffened and pulled back as I turned toward the sound. Two figures stepped out of a car at the gate, Maddie, and behind her, Veronica. The storm outside had calmed, but the storm waiting inside the driveway had only just begun. The air around the villa felt thinner as Maddie and Veronica stepped through the open gate. Snow clung to their coats and hair, catching the early morning light like shards of frost. Ethan stood beside me, chest heaving, face streaked with the remnants of tears he didn't bother to hide. The warmth spilling from Silvercrest behind us contrasted sharply with the tension filling the driveway, a fragile bridge between who we had been and who we were about to become. Maddie was the first to move. She rushed toward Ethan, her boots slipping slightly on the icy path. "You weren't home!" she cried, grabbing his arm as if anchoring herself. "I was terrified something happened to you." It wasn't an unreasonable fear, and she wasn't faking the tremor in her voice. But fear born from losing control was very different from fear born from love. Veronica remained a few steps behind, her posture stiff, chin lifted in a way that was meant to project composure. But her hands, gloved and clasped tightly, gave her away. They trembled just enough to betray her nerves. I watched them both for a moment, letting silence settle before I spoke. My voice came out steady, quiet but unmistakably firm. "Maddie, why are you here today?" Her head snapped toward me. Her eyes, glossy with cold and adrenaline, narrowed slightly. You posted that photo," she said, breath fogging in the air. "You did it to humiliate me." "I posted a snowy morning," I replied, my tone still even. "If truth embarrassed you, that truth isn't mine." The wind moved through the pine trees above us, sending soft cascades of snow down onto the driveway. Maddie flinched as the flakes touched her cheeks, as if the cold belonged only to her. "Everyone saw it," she continued, voice edging toward panic. "Everyone! You made it look like we left you out on purpose." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You did," he said quietly. She turned toward him in disbelief. "I was trying to manage everything. I was trying to keep the dinner from falling apart." "By lying about my mother?" he asked. "By talking about her like she's lesser?" Maddie stepped back as though the words had physical weight. Her breath hitched. "I didn't mean—" But before she could finish, Veronica snapped. "Oh, please, Maddie, she was always afraid of Catherine. Always." The words sliced through the cold air. Maddie froze. Ethan stared at his mother-in-law, and Veronica, perhaps realizing too late what she'd said aloud, drew in a sharp breath, one hand rising to cover her mouth. My voice, when it finally broke through the stunned stillness, was soft but piercing. "Afraid of me." Veronica dropped her hand, her composure slipping at the edges. "Since the day Ethan showed me your picture on their first date," she confessed in a rush. "She said you looked strong, unshakable. She didn't know how to measure up." Maddie's eyes widened in something between betrayal and shame. "Mom, stop!" But the truth was already loose, spreading in the cold like steam from a cracked pipe. Ethan turned toward Maddie, confusion and disbelief warring across his face. "You've been insecure about my mother? For 20 years? Maddie's shoulders folded inward. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked small, not in stature, but in certainty. She was everything I wasn't," she whispered. "You admired her so much. I didn't know how to compete with that." "You weren't supposed to," I said gently. "I never asked you to fight me, and I never tried to win." Her breath broke on a sob. Tears spilled down her cheeks, catching the light like tiny beads of glass. She shook her head, voice trembling. "I thought if I didn't keep you close, you'd drift toward her, that I'd lose you." Ethan swallowed hard. "You didn't have to push her away to keep me," he said. "And I let you fight a battle that shouldn't have existed. I stood back instead of standing between you both." Maddie's tears turned heavier. She covered her mouth, shoulders shaking, no longer holding herself together for show. The navy scarf around my neck fluttered in the breeze, brushing lightly against my coat. I felt the weight of Jonathan's sketches in the villa behind me, the faint scent of cedar wood drifting through the crack in the door. In that moment, I understood something profoundly simple. Maddie wasn't my enemy. She was her own. I stepped forward, not to console, but to clarify. "All this time," I said quietly, "you weren't fighting me. You were fighting the shadow of who you thought you had to be." Maddie lowered her hands and nodded slowly, as if the truth itself exhausted her. "I know," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to stop." Ethan turned his gaze toward the snow-covered ground. "And I let her fight it alone," he said, voice hollow with regret. Silence followed, deep, wide, heavy. I let it breathe before I spoke again. "I will not open my home or my heart to anyone who believes my kindness is weakness," I said finally. "Not anymore." The air itself seemed to pause. Even the falling snowflakes drifted slower, as though listening. Veronica looked away. Maddie covered her face again. Ethan closed his eyes, a pained wince crossing his features. Behind us, the soft glow of the villa's lights illuminated Jonathan's unfinished dream, a place of warmth, unity, truth. But before I stepped back inside, my eyes drifted toward the table sketch I'd left on the counter. A table meant for togetherness, a table built for dignity, a table that would not seat deceit, and deep inside me, I felt the final door unlock. The house had fallen quiet again, not the tense silence of confrontation, but the gentle, heavy stillness that follows truth. I walked down the hallway alone, my fingers grazing the cedar trim Jonathan once sanded by hand, until I reached the studio. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open, and warm light spilled across the familiar space. His notebook lay on the drafting table, open to the final page, as if waiting for me. I stepped closer. The page had yellowed slightly with time, edges feathered from handling. Jonathan's handwriting wavered in places, the letters dipping, trembling. He must have written this when he was already weak. My breath caught before I even read the words. A small object rested gently across the center fold. The walnut comb, the same one he used every morning. The same one he always joked made him look half presentable. Seeing it, there felt like seeing the imprint of his hand. I lifted it carefully, then looked down at what he had left beneath it. If one day she loses her place at the table, let her build a bigger table. I traced the handwriting with my fingertips. The graphite left a faint dusting on my skin, like the ghost of his touch. Below the message, he had sketched a long oval table, wide, warm, welcoming. Seats enough for anyone who chose respect over convenience, sincerity over performance. I felt tears gathering, but they didn't burn. They didn't hollow me out. They arrived gently, settling into the spaces inside me that had long waited for understanding. He knew, I whispered to the quiet room. He knew before I did, that I deserved a place where I belonged. A breeze slipped through the slightly open window, stirring the curtains. Candlelight flickered across the sketch, making it look alive, reflecting the hope he had woven into every stroke. At the bottom of the page, in his steadier script, he had added one more line. Kindness must have a home of its own. I pressed my palm flat against the paper, letting the warmth of my skin bleed into the cold surface. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry, not from hurt, but from release, from gratitude, from the quiet truth that love sometimes prepares us for storms we cannot yet see. When the last tear fell, I closed the notebook softly. Snow brushed the window in gentle patterns, inviting me forward. It was time. The living room felt softer than usual, as if the villa itself understood what needed to happen within its walls. The golden lamps cast a warm glow across the walnut table, turning the grain of the wood into gentle waves. Outside, snow drifted past the windows in slow, steady flakes, quiet witnesses to a conversation long overdue. I poured chamomile tea into 3 cups, the steam rising in delicate spirals. My other hand rested lightly on Jonathan's walnut comb, the familiar weight grounding me. Ethan sat upright on the couch, hands clasped, eyes lowered. Beside him, Maddie shrank into herself, shoulders curved inward, her red-rimmed eyes fixed on the floor. I took my seat across from them. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't harsh. It was intentional, giving each of us space to settle. When I began, my voice was calm. I'm not asking for an apology, I said. I'm asking for respect, starting today. Maddie flinched gently, her breath catching. Her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve. I didn't know how to share Ethan, she said softly. I thought I had to outshine you to keep him. I see now how wrong that was. There was no shouting, no accusations flung like weapons, only truth, spoken plainly. Ethan lifted his head, guilt tightening his jaw. Mom, I should have stepped in earlier. I should have seen what was happening between you two. I shook my head. This isn't about blame, I said. Blame keeps people frozen. Understanding moves us forward. Maddie swallowed, eyes glistening. My mother always told me the biggest threat to a marriage is the mother-in-law. I grew up thinking I had to protect myself from you, even before I met you. Her voice cracked on the last word. Across from her, Veronica looked down, shame bending her posture. For once, she had no smooth answer, no elegant way out. The room absorbed Maddie's confession with a gentle stillness. Snow continued to fall, softening the world outside, as though giving us something to lean on. I leaned forward, hands wrapped around my warm cup. Maddie, I began gently, I never tried to take Ethan from you, and I never asked him to choose between us. The peace you lost didn't come from me. It came from the fears you carried. She covered her mouth with shaking fingers. I know, she whispered. I'm so tired of being afraid. Ethan reached for her hand but waited inches away, asking silently if the gesture would be welcome. Maddie nodded through a tear, and he took her hand with quiet care. His voice was low. "I should have been between both of you, not behind anyone. That's my fault." The admission surprised me with its tenderness. For the first time, I saw not a man caught between two women, but a son finally stepping into maturity. I looked at both of them, letting the warmth of the room anchor what I felt. "We can move forward," I said, "but only if we build something honest. I won't reopen my life to old patterns or quiet wounds. Respect has to lead every step." The navy scarf across my lap felt like a soft reminder of boundaries, of warmth, of who I had become since leaving Seattle. I placed the scarf gently on the arm of the chair and reached out, placing my hand lightly over Maddie's trembling one. Her breath stuttered, and she looked up for the first time. The vulnerability in her eyes was raw, unshielded. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first door opening. We sat there, the three of us, breathing the same quiet air, letting the truth settle into place. Outside, the snowfall softened into a near-silent drift. Change, it seemed, didn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it came like this: slow, steady, inevitable. After a pause, I drew in a deep breath. "We all need time," I said. "Space heals, when it's respected." Ethan nodded. Maddie did too, tears slipping down her cheeks without urgency. In that small, warm room, a new beginning stirred. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Next year, Christmas at Silvercrest would look different, not because everything would be fixed, but because we finally knew what needed mending. A year slipped by in the way quiet healing often does, not with dramatic declarations or perfect endings, but with steady steps, new habits, and spaces kept sacred. By the time the next Christmas arrived, Silvercrest Villa felt less like a house Jonathan had left behind and more like the home I had grown into. Snow blanketed the villa that morning in soft, sparkling layers, catching every bit of daylight like the mountains themselves were decorated for the holiday. I wrapped a scarf around my shoulders, the one I had knitted slowly over the course of the year, each stitch a small promise to myself. The navy yarn held warmth differently than the old scarf. This one carried intention. Inside, cedarwood candles flickered in every room, filling the villa with a gentle scent that made the walls feel close and kind. I moved from table to counter to stove, placing candles the way Jonathan once placed architectural notes, thoughtfully, with quiet meaning. On the long walnut table, the maple-glazed turkey rested beneath foil, the glaze giving off a soft shine even before it was revealed. I followed Jonathan's handwritten recipe exactly, tracing each step twice to be sure. This wasn't just cooking, it was honoring. The doorbell chimed, pulling me from the last touches of preparation. Cousin Marla and Uncle Roy stepped inside with the unmistakable cheer they brought to every gathering. "Look at this place," Marla exclaimed, her eyes sparkling. Jonathan would be so proud. I felt the warmth of her words settle into my chest as Roy carried in a box of ornaments. We moved through the villa together, laughing as we adjusted garlands, fluffed branches on the tree, and fussed over ribbons that refused to stay straight. Their presence felt like a soft hum of familiarity, a reweaving of family ties that had frayed but survived. A knock sounded next, soft but steady. When I opened the door, Harlan stood there with a cherry pie held carefully in his gloved hands. "For the table," he said, eyes gentle. It was her favorite. He didn't need to say his late wife's name. The memory floated in with him like an old friend. I touched the edge of the pie tin. "Thank you, Harlan. She'd be glad you remembered." By midday, the villa glowed. Snow continued falling outside the tall windows, drifting slowly in a way that made the world feel hushed, reverent. Ethan arrived next, carrying a stack of gifts under one arm, Owen clinging to his leg, and Lucy running ahead with a burst of delighted laughter. The moment they stepped inside, the villa shifted, lightened, as if the air recognized the sound of children and welcomed it. "Grandma, look!" Lucy held up a paper snowflake she had cut herself. Owen tugged at my sleeve, proudly showing off his knitted hat. Ethan kissed my cheek, his eyes carrying a warmth that still surprised me in the best ways. For a while, the house felt wonderfully full. Conversation weaving gently through the rooms, music humming in the background, the tree lights flickering like tiny, steady heartbeats. And then the front door opened again. Maddie stood in the doorway, snow settling on her coat, a small hardcover book held tightly against her chest. Her eyes met mine, hopeful and hesitant all at once. I made this for you," she said, stepping inside slowly. The book was simple, bound in dark blue fabric. Embossed on the cover were the words, "The Gratitude Book." My breath caught before I even opened it. Inside, each page held a sentence, sometimes two, small acknowledgments, soft truths, things she had come to understand over the past year. "Thank you for raising a man who loves deeply. Thank you for opening your home even when your heart was hurting. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like." Halfway through, a photo appeared, me holding Ethan when he was no older than Owen, my arms wrapped around him, his small face pressed into my shoulder. The last page was blank except for a single line at the top. "For the memories we haven't made yet." I felt my eyes sting, my throat tighten. The weight of a year, of growth, of quiet work, of new beginnings, pressed gently against my heart. I stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in, Maddie," I said, smiling. "This home keeps only kindness, and kindness grows here when we nurture it." She exhaled shakily and entered. Ethan reached for her hand, steady and sure, and she took it. Across the room, Harlan watched with a soft, unobtrusive smile, as if witnessing Jonathan's dream unfold. Dinner was a warm blur of laughter, clinking silverware, passing dishes, children giggling and candlelight dancing across every face at the table. When I finally took my seat at the head, the place Jonathan once told me I deserved, I felt something settle inside me. Belonging, not granted by anyone else, built by my own hands. The sounds of dinner had softened into a warm hum that drifted gently through the villa. Laughter from the children, the clink of cutlery, the low murmur of conversations that carried no sharp edges. Candlelight shimmered across the long walnut table, catching the curve of glasses and the soft folds of napkins. For once, no one felt the need to fill silence with excuses or explanations. Peace didn't need commentary. I sat quietly among them, letting the scene settle into my memory like fresh ink onto paper. No one brought up last year's Christmas. No one revisited the wounds we had already tended. Tonight wasn't about patching the past. It was about witnessing what had grown in its place. After dessert was cleared and the room filled with the faint scent of cinnamon and cedarwood, I slipped away to the studio. The candles inside flickered the way they always did, tiny flames stretching gently toward the ceiling, brushing their light across Jonathan's sketches on the wall. His notebook waited on the drafting table. I opened it with the same care I'd give a fragile heirloom. The pages rustled softly. The last page glowed beneath the candlelight, the graphite strokes deepening as the flame bent toward them. I traced the familiar words with a steady hand. If she loses her place at the table, let her build a bigger table. The message no longer ached. Tonight it resonated. Tonight I understood it not as a warning, but as a calling. I looked up and through the open doorway into the living room. The oval table stood there, full and warm, surrounded by people who chose kindness, not perfection, not performance, but genuine connection. Some were bound to me by blood, others by shared history, others simply by the choice to stay. Jonathan had imagined this place for me, but I had built this moment for myself. I closed the notebook gently. As I did, the walnut comb resting between the pages slipped free. It fell onto the floor with the softest tap before a breeze from the cracked window nudged it forward. It slid across the wood, lifted slightly, then disappeared through the gap under the door, carried away by the winter air. I didn't chase it. Letting it go felt right. A symbol released. A chapter closed. I stepped out onto the balcony, the cold air brushing against my face without biting. Snow drifted lazily downward, catching the villa's golden glow in its descent. Behind me, through the large glass doors, the silhouettes of family moved gently around the table, passing plates, pouring tea, leaning close in conversation. A picture of belonging, a picture I once thought would never include me again. I rested my hands on the railing, feeling the solid cedar beneath my palms. The mountains stood dark and steady in the distance, their presence grounding. My voice settled in the quiet night, soft but clear in the way truth often is. Last year, I lost my place at their table, I said. This year, I built a table big enough for everyone who chooses kindness. Snowflakes landed on my scarf, melting instantly. Christmas isn't about being invited, I whispered. It's about being valued. Inside, someone laughed, deep, warm, familiar. It pulled a smile from me before I even realized it. My breath rose into the cold air, not as a sigh of longing, but as a release. Healing, warm, full circle. I turned back toward the open door and walked inside, not as someone returning reluctantly, but as the woman who finally knew she belonged. Here, at her own table.